So, welcome to our webinar, Awkward to Awesome, Managing Difficult Conversations. And as usual, I'm going to kick off with a question for you to have a think about. The question is quite simple, really. Have you ever felt your heart racing before having one of those challenging conversations at work? And if you can just put your answer in chat, and really three options: yes, no, or actually, I'm overthinking a conversation I've got to have right now. Hello, Meg. Yeah, most of us have had those kind of conversations where we've had the kind of sweaty palms, perhaps, is another sign. You can feel your heart kind of pounding in your chest. Absolutely brilliant. Well, I mean, for most of us, when we have a difficult conversation or we have to have a difficult conversation, it just doesn't feel good. That anticipation of having it really doesn't feel good. And, those sweaty palms, that sudden spike in adrenaline, or that nagging fear that you're about to, well, trigger something, the unknown, basically. And perhaps a long held grudge is going to be the result of it, upsetting a team bond. Right now, kind of thing, is all these things are going through our mind. So the grounding kind of truth to all this is that actually all those experiences, it's just completely human. According to some studies carried out by Carolyn Castrillion, it was, she published an article, I think it was Forbes, back in 2021 actually, but her research showed that over 80% of people at work are currently avoiding at least one conversation that they know they really should have. And on top of that, a massive 70% of employees admit to totally dodging tough talks. They just completely avoid them. So I think it's important that we think about, if our heart races, it's not that we're failing. You're just actually part of the majority. The danger isn't that feeling. The actual danger is avoiding the conversation. Because, the longer we let these conversations wait, the worse it gets. And then when they finally do kind of break out, erupt, the damage to trust and goodwill can be huge, almost perhaps even irreversible. So, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Michelle MacArthur Morgan, founding partner and creator of the Jigsaw Discovery Tool. I started my career back a very long time ago now in the hospitality sector, working in both operational and then moving across into leadership and senior leadership before moving into learning and development some 26 years ago now. And my work has taken me far and wide, working with organisations not only throughout the UK, but also in the UAE, Europe, America, in both public and kind of corporate world. And academically, where this kind of all started, whilst I was working in the hospitality sector, I got a degree in psychology. My brain, I was getting bored, to be honest with you. And my manager said, why don't you do a degree? Just, keep yourself occupied a little bit. And I did a degree in psychology. And that actually got me hooked into finding out more about human behaviour. But then for the last 18 years, I've actually been a student of neuroscience, studying the latest research. And now I'm a member of a global group called the Neuro Nerds. And we meet once a month online and talk about all the latest kind of research. And we have group meetings with some of the world's leading neuroscientists and discuss what they're working on and what that's actually going to mean for us in the world of work. So that's kind of a little bit about my background. In our webinar today, the things we're going to look at and discuss: how to take things from awkward to awesome, those difficult conversations. We're going to be unpacking the neuroscience behind why your brain treats that difficult feedback session, that difficult conversation, like a physical threat. And we'll end the session by giving you practical kind of tools to help cool down the tension, bridge the gap between your intention and how you're actually perceived, and be able to turn that kind of conflict, that uncomfortable feeling, that friction into kind of genuine team magic. So, as usual, the webinar is divided into chapters, four kind of main chapters that we're going to be talking about today. So we've got the neuroscience and psychology of avoidance. Then we're going to have a brief look at some of the cost of actually evasion or avoidance of these difficult conversations. Then we're going to have a look at the intention versus perception. And finally, in chapter 4, we're going to be looking at some of the tools of how we can override the avoidance response. I said at the beginning that 80% of people in the workplace are avoiding a conversation, and that they really know they really should be having. But the question is, why are they avoiding it? Well, in a moment, we're going to look at the science. But for most of us, those difficult conversations, they just take us way outside of our comfort zone. And we kind of fear that, there's that fear factor there that we could make the whole situation worse. It could blow up in our faces. But as I'm sure we all know, probably through personal experience, ignored problems just fester. They don't go away. They continue to grow until eventually they will come to a head. And then very often the damage that is caused to relationships, trust, perhaps goodwill, is far greater than it would have been had the conversation been held when the situation first occurred. I've got a friend who's a mediator, and he works on so many cases that take weeks of mediation to be able to get to some kind of resolve, some solution. And the sad thing is that in many of the instances, if an initial conversation had taken place, the issue could have been addressed really quite simply without the need for mediation and all that disruption and cost caused by the problem of simply just not having a conversation early enough, just leaving things to fester. So, what is a difficult conversation? If we look in any workplace, difficult conversations are just lurking, they're waiting to be had. Difficult conversations aren't always massive or dramatic showdowns. Very often, they're much more functional or operational, everyday occurrences where the stakes just feel to be really high. I just want you to pop into chat for me. What is the single hardest topic for you personally to bring up with either a manager or a colleague? So just one word kind of thing in chat. What's the single hardest topic? Taking time off, salary, conduct. Yeah, conversations that involve big outcomes around the party, disciplinaries. I also remember as a junior manager having to do in the very early days, doing my first few disciplinaries. And I'm not kidding, my knees were knocking. I was more worried about it and frightened of it than the actual person that I was actually going to have to talk to, I swear. So, yes. So, the Chartered Management Institute, the CMI, they carried out some research and they actually compiled the top 10 most difficult conversations that people have. So, what do you think was in the first three? What were the top three most difficult? Just pop your thoughts in chat for me. What do you think were in the first three, the top three? Money, ending relationship and promotion, ending employment, personal hygiene, reducing hours, turning down internal application. Yeah. Well, in actual fact, according to the research by the Chartered Management Institute. The top three all came in pretty equally, actually. Um, and top of the list was pay. Pay was the number one most difficult conversation to have with somebody. Talking about salary, pay scales, or asking for a rise, they, according to the research, were the kind of number one ultimate conversational mountain to climb. And that was closely followed then by inappropriate behaviour in the workplace and addressing the colleague who perhaps interrupts constantly, boundaries being crossed, conduct that violates team values, etc. That was number two, and poor performance, giving feedback on poor performance. And for leaders, this was a really massive hurdle, according to the research. And really, it comes down to feeling that, you're the bearer of kind of bad news. And we don't want to hurt people. We don't want to hurt our team. We worry how it'll actually come across. So, going on what the research has kind of found. So, why do you think these three, pay, behaviour, poor performance, feel so intensely high stake, difficult conversations? What's your thoughts on that? Again, just pop some answers in chat for me. Yeah, good one. No training, lack of confidence, competence, big outcomes. It's not really a convo you expect to have in a workplace. Yeah, they can feel very personal. Yeah. Yeah, we have a vested interest in the subject and the people that we're talking to. We do care about them. And at the very least, our daily kind of peace of mind, if it's our team, depends upon these people. So tensions do run high because there's always something personal on the line when we're having these conversations. So just moving into chapter one now. So we've kind of talked a little bit about what conversations we typically find difficult. So I want to kind of look underneath that, look at the science behind them. So, why do you think it is that even when we know a conversation is absolutely necessary, at least 70% of us will choose to avoid it, having the conversation? Why do you think that is? What's holding us back? Again, just pop some answers in chat. Why do you avoid having those difficult conversations? Yeah, hard to make ourselves uncomfortable, a lack of training, worry about repercussions, concerned about how we're viewed. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's now take a look at some of this kind of rich science of avoidance, the neuroscience of avoidance. So, at the foundation of avoidance behaviour is what research describes as the brain's core operating principle to minimise danger, maximise reward. Every stimulus our brain encounters gets rapidly tagged as either approach or avoid, and this happens before our conscious thought kicks in. Difficult conversations obviously get tagged as a threat almost automatically, which means that the avoidance response is already in motion before you've even consciously decided whether to have the conversation or not. Neuroscience identifies two distinct motivational systems in the brain. The approach system, which is left prefrontal cortex dominant, and that drives us towards reward, possibility, goal attainment. And the avoidance system, which is dominated our right prefrontal cortex. And that drives us away from threat, punishment, any kind of loss. And research on these systems shows that the avoidance motivation generates far more arousal in the limbic system more quickly and with longer lasting effects than the approach motivation. In simple terms, the pull away from a threat is neurologically stronger than the pull towards a threat. And this is why, at a kind of intellectual level, we know we should have a conversation. But it's very rare that that knowing actually can overcome that kind of feeling that we've got that perhaps we shouldn't. And this is down to our approach and avoidance systems. The scare model, which was created by Linda Ray of Neurocapability, or perhaps some of you are more familiar with David Rock's SCARF model. And it looks at the 5 social domains that our brains are constantly monitoring as we're scanning the environment around us. And each of these domains can trigger a threat or reward response. And in relation to a difficult conversation, when we anticipate having that difficult conversation, then multiple scare domains fire simultaneously, which is why that avoidance pull feels so strong. So, for example, if I just give you one for each, significance. We think about, what if they think less of me? Was it Andrew mentioned something along those lines? What if I handle it badly? How's that going to affect my significance or status, as David Rock would say? The certainty. I don't know how they're going to react. I just can't predict the outcome from this. The autonomy. Once I start this conversation, I could lose control of where it goes. That feeling of loss of control. Relatedness. It could damage our relationship permanently. And the last one, fairness, or as David Rock says, equity, in the scare model. Am I being fed? Have I actually got all the facts, all the information? Now, one of the most powerful drivers of avoidance is uncertainty about the outcome. And the brain has a strong need for predictability. One of its core functions is a prediction machine. Therefore, certainty is a core scare or scarf domain for a very good reason. Research shows us that uncertainty activates the same threat network as a negative outcome, sometimes even more strongly. So the brain would rather avoid the conversation entirely than sit with the discomfort of not knowing what's going to happen. And when 2 or 3 scare domains are threatened simultaneously, the brain's threat response is amplified significantly, really making avoidance feel, not just tempting, but we're almost neurologically compelled to avoid. The amygdala, which we can see on the screen there, right down in the kind of the core of the brain, it's your brain's threat detection centre. And it processes social threats in the same way as it processes a physical threat. And some research carried out by Eisenberger and Lieberman showed that social pain activates the same neural circuitry as physical pain. So what that actually means is when we anticipate a difficult conversation, the amygdala fires a threat signal. So the limbic system, we prepare to fight, flight, or freeze. Blood flow is redirected away from our prefrontal cortex. And our capacity for rational, logical thinking, empathy, and nuanced communication is literally reduced. Now, the cruel irony here is that the very cognitive resources that we need to have the conversation, the difficult conversation well, are the ones that get taken offline when we're just thinking about having it. Fast and slow thinking systems, the 2 core thinking systems of the brain, a concept popularised by Daniel Kahneman, I think it's pronounced, also referred to as System 1, System 2 thinking. And drawing on the dual process theory, avoidance is largely a System 1 automatic, fast emotional response. Our conscious, rational mind, system 2, may know that the conversation is necessary and actually is overdue, but system 1 has already tagged it as it's dangerous, and system 1 is working hard to keep us away from it. And some research by the Neuro Leadership Institute, in their research notes, they state goals set through an individual's rational, conscious system 2 thinking are unconsciously undermined by the brain's system 1 goal. So the reason we know we've got to have that or we should have that conversation, but our instinct, our survival instinct, is actually overriding that to try to keep us safe. So the fact we avoid a difficult conversation isn't weakness, it's not lack of courage or a poor character. It's the brain doing exactly what it's designed to do. It's protecting us from perceived threats. So the challenge is that the brain can't distinguish between the tiger and a performance conversation. So we stay silent to protect ourselves. But while avoidance might give us a tiny moment of temporary relief, we know that there's always going to be the long-term bill to pay. So just want to take a moment for reflection and knowing a little bit more about the science. What's your kind of key takeaway from that science? Again, just pop your any thoughts you've got into chat. That'd be great. It's natural response. Yeah, we're fighting biology. Absolutely. Okay, so quick look at chapter 2, the cost of avoidance. We've just looked at how the brain's naturally being pulled towards avoidance to protect ourselves. And it does feel easier in the moment just to look the other way. But avoiding these conversations, as we've said, just makes it worse. So what do you think are some of the costs of avoidance? Again, just pop some answers in chat. That would be brilliant. Yeah, staff turnover, low morale, problem grows, no clear expectations. Yeah. Serious dispute, lose friends. Yeah, absolutely. Well, again, just looking at this, just giving you a few kind of thoughts. There's first of all the time that is wasted while we are overthinking the situation. And of course, it's not just us that is having to have that difficult conversation, it's the other party or parties involved as well. So we can lose an awful lot of time. And some research reveals that about 43% of employees spend 2 weeks or more completely overthinking unresolved work issues. You multiply that out, that's an awful lot. And then, of course, there's also the financial cost of people not speaking up. An article in Forbes stated that 1/3 of employees believed that it financially cost their organisation because they kept quiet at a critical moment. They didn't want to challenge or have that difficult conversation, perhaps with their manager, something that they had discovered. But there's also the human cost that is even more concerning, and that is the impact on mental health. There was a major research study carried out, it was actually carried out towards the end of COVID by Lumina, and it was discovered that people who feel uncertain about meeting their managers or their organisations' expectations, that feel uncertain about those expectations. They don't have a clear understanding of what their managers or organisations' expectations of them are, had up to a 16% higher mental health risk factor compared to the employees who felt quite confident and had clarity of what was expected from them. And this links back into what we've just been talking about, that craving for certainty and being uncomfortable with the unknown. And if we think about that as a leader, when we actually avoid having a difficult conversation, let's say about performance or expectations, because we think actually, we want to spare someone's feelings, in actual fact, we may think that we're doing a good thing, that we're sparing somebody's feelings, but actually, we could be driving up their mental health risk by 16% due to the anxiety of the unknown that they are experiencing. So, talking about performance management and setting expectations might seem like quite a mundane, routine task, but actually, it's a vital act of care for your team's well-being. Avoiding difficult conversations won't make them magically go away. Ignored problems fester, they bubble beneath the surface until finally explode. And as we know, from experience, when situations do explode, it always happens at the wrong time. When the stakes are really high, when the pressure is totally maxed out. And we can be absolutely sure that those explosions will cause a massive amount of fallout, irreversible damage perhaps, compared to if we'd have had the conversation earlier and it was just those minor ripples that would have been caused at that time. So if avoidance costs us our budget, our culture, and our mental health, we've got to start thinking about what we are going to do about it. How do we stop building walls and start building bridges? So I want to move into our next, chapter 3 now, where we're going to be looking at the intention versus perception gap and how we can use self-awareness to make sure our messages actually land the way we mean them to. So we're now ready to kind of pull up the chair, have a conversation. And this is where we can run straight into a common, dangerous stumbling block that can completely derail our best intentions. And that is the intention versus perception gap. And this gap happens when our words are perceived entirely different to the way we intended them. The truth is, none of us see reality objectively. We all see life through our own personal filters, our unique backgrounds, where we come from, our values, our past experiences, all heavily shape our communication and behavioural style and how we interpret communication, feedback. And there is a psychological trap as well to be aware of, and we tend to judge ourselves by our intentions, but we judge everyone else by their actions. When you're the person doing the speaking, you know exactly what you're intending, what your intention is. But the other person only sees and hears your behaviour, and they interpret that through their own unique filter. So if we just think about how that could play out in reality, for example, you may think that you're being objective and logical, but the other person is actually perceiving you as being cold and lacking in understanding. Or you may think that you're being open-minded and flexible, but the other person perceives you as being disorganised and lacking in focus or clear direction. Or you might think that you're providing detailed instructions, and the other person might perceive you as being a bit of a micromanager. So I'm just going to stop for a moment and I'll just give you a moment to think about a time when you have actually fallen into this intention versus perception trap. And by all means, if you just want to, you don't have to, but if you want to just pop into chat, perhaps an example of what you intended, but how it was perceived. Yeah, Andrew, yeah. Gave them too much of the good, so they didn't hear the bad. Yeah. One that happened to me actually a few years ago now. In my mind, my intention was to actually just show one of my colleagues that, I cared about them because they'd come into work and they had a poorly arm. They'd hurt their arm and the wrist. And we had a big training course going on that day in the offices. And this particular colleague would always bring in large jugs of tea and coffee throughout the day, etc. And just before we were about to start, I actually went across to her and I thought I'd kind of shown some care and said, look, don't worry about bringing in the heavy jugs of tea and coffee all day. I'll get somebody else to do it. What she perceived from that, because of the way that I had come across in my kind of delivery actually of it, what she perceived was that I was annoyed with her for some reason. She didn't know why, but she thought I was annoyed and that basically I was telling her that I didn't want to see her in the room that day. And that was totally, I had no clue until my colleague came to me, another colleague came to me and said, "What on earth did you say?" And that was another great example of that intention perception kind of gap. Just reading through some of the things. Absolutely. Yeah, that's a good one, Ian. Yeah, we all have a selective ear, a selective perception. Yeah, people want to see how it suits them. Yep. So, the Jigsaw Discovery Behavioral Framework, if you're not familiar with it, it basically simplifies the world of human behaviour and communication into four kind of foundational communication behavioural styles. They're not rigid boxes or tests that you pass or fail. The best way of thinking about them is four distinct drivers that describe how we prefer to focus our energy, our attention, how we prefer to talk and to listen. So, as we've just discussed, and especially when we are under pressure, feeling stressed, the way our communication is interpreted, can be very different from the way that we actually intended. In chapter 1, we discussed when faced with a difficult conversation, the brain immediately perceives it as a potential threat, and access to our full cognitive, logical, rational thinking is impaired. When we're in that stressful situation, our natural communication style actually becomes exaggerated and we tend to overplay our strengths, and that intention perception gap widens. So what I'm going to do just in the next few slides is just take a little bit of a closer look, looking at the using the Jigsaw discovery preferences to help us better understand that kind of the gap and how we can start to bridge the intention perception gap with our communication. And this is just a very, very quick kind of intro to it. Obviously, there's a lot more depth, but very quickly, one of our preferences, we call it the action preference, naturally speaks really quite quickly. They interrupt just to speed things up because they don't like wasting time. Now, under pressure, they can overplay that. And if we look at the third column, the column on the right of the screen, then we can see that under pressure, they can very easily come across as pushy, dominating, even down to aggressive and demanding, ignores feelings, lacking in compassion. So that's not how that person probably intended to come across at all. And very often, when we realise how we do come across, it comes as quite a shock to us. So it's just, again, increasing our self-awareness, having that understanding of how our actions, behaviours, our words are likely to be perceived. If we then look at our creative preferences, so speaks very enthusiastically, goes off on tangents, jumps around on topics, quite a ideas type individual. But again, under pressure, when they start to overplay this, they become across as being very disorganized, perhaps emotional, very impulsive type individual, erratic, perhaps exaggerating the situation. So again, we can start to see how that intention perception gap can occur. Our green, our caring. Um, Usually they're kind of natural style. They're very people focused, very caring, very open individuals, great kind of listeners, etc. But under pressure, they can they become very passive, can back away from conflict. Um, they very much can become quite dependent um, on other people because they have a lack of confidence that comes through when they are under pressure, and can become really quite vague and come across again. They bottle up their kind of emotion until it does eventually explode. And then our last blue organised characters, quite measured and formal, reserved. They're very much into detail, analysing out situations. They look at all the facts. But under pressure, they can come across as being very, very critical, very cold, very bogged down in the detail, but become perceived as being a bit of a job's worth, bit of a perfectionist. They become quite rigid and inflexible, or can be perceived as being quite rigid and inflexible. So again, it's another example of how that intention perception gap can occur, and just to give you that kind of flavour for it. So how do we close that gap then? Well, self-awareness is the secret weapon because self-awareness helps us to maintain our composure during these tense interactions because we have that awareness of how we may be perceived if we actually start to overplay, if we let the pressure of the situation get to us. And I will talk about that more in the next chapter. And when we are deeply aware, we have high levels of self-awareness of what makes us tick, our own communication preferences and our emotional triggers, we can actually stop reacting instinctively and start responding thoughtfully. We can have some control over that. But self-awareness is only half of that bridge. We also need that understanding of others. And again, that's where through tools like the Jigsaw framework, we can actually understand other people. Because team members aren't just names on a spreadsheet. They're real people with their own filters, their own emotional well-being and communication preferences. And when we combine that self-awareness with the understanding of team dynamics, then we can deliberately choose our attitude before a conversation even starts. We stop trying to win the argument and instead we actually map an approach that is going to land almost perfectly as possible with the other person. So, just want you to think of a difficult conversation you've avoided in the past, and you've eventually gone ahead and had it. You've been had to have it for whatever reason. But what was your intention for that conversation? And how was it perceived? And perhaps most importantly, what would you do differently if you were to have that conversation again? Now, again, if you would like to share in chat, that's absolutely wonderful, but no pressure to do that. I just want to give you just a moment to digest what we've been speaking about. So, moving into our last chapter then. Yeah, I'm sending one-to-ones versus group, yeah. So chapter 4 then, overriding the avoidance response. So we've uncovered now that intention perception gap. We know that self-awareness can be our secret kind of weapon to start to bridge it. But how do we put this all into practice when we're sitting face to face or screen to screen with someone? And what I want to do is start and really go back to chapter 1, the neuroscience of avoidance. But this time I want to explore the science of what actually enables people to be able to override that avoidance response and have the conversation anyway. So I'm going to go through a few tools, techniques that are all grounded very much in kind of the neuroscience to help us override that strong neurological kind of pull that we have towards avoidance. So the most powerful neurological lever is cognitive reappraisal, the ability to consciously reframe how the brain has labelled an experience. So research shows that when we deliberately reframe a threatening situation, activity in the amygdala decreases, while activity in the prefrontal cortex increases. So you're essentially using your thinking brain to regulate your emotional brain. So for difficult conversations, this sounds like shifting from thinking that the conversation could go badly to this is a conversation of an act of care. Or another example might be they might react badly to not having this conversation is the real risk. Or we might be saying to ourselves, I might get it wrong. But let's reframe that. A good enough conversation is better than no conversation. Now, the reframe has got to be genuinely believable to the brain. Just some hollow, positive kind of spin that you put on it won't shift the amygdala. But a meaningful reframe, such as the ones that I've just given you as an example there, can genuinely alter that neurological threat assessment and move it away from the threat. The second strategy, reducing uncertainty. Since uncertainty is one of the kind of primary drivers of avoidance, anything that increases predictability reduces the threat signal and it makes the approach system much more accessible. So this is why preparation really does matter neurologically, not just from a practical point of view. So when you actually think through likely responses, take the time, think through the likely responses reaction in advance. If you clarify the key messages of your conversation in advance, if you perhaps prepare a clear opening line, then you're literally reducing the amygdala activation because you're giving the brain more certainty about what's ahead, what's likely to come. So the conversation will naturally feel less dangerous because it feels less unknown. Psychological safety. Research consistently shows that psychological safety doesn't just help the recipient of a difficult conversation, but it also helps the person initiating that conversation. When we feel safe in our environment, when we feel supported by our leaders, then we're not threatened by the consequences of imperfection. So we have a much lower baseline threat level. So that means when we do have that additional threat load of having to have or start a difficult conversation, it's less likely to tip and turn into a full amygdala hijack, a really, really strong threat response. And this is one of the most compelling, but often least expressed arguments for building psychological safety at both team and organisational level. Because it's not just about people speaking up, it's about leaders being able to have the conversation that performance requires. The if-then mechanism, one of the most robust findings in behaviour change research, is the power of if-then planning. When people pre-decide their behaviour in a specific situation, they dramatically increase the likelihood of following through, even under threat conditions. So, for example, in a difficult conversation, this could look like, if I notice I'm avoiding this conversation for a third day, then I'll send a meeting invite immediately. If they become defensive, then I'll pause, take a breath, and ask a curious question. Now, the reason this works neurologically is that it transfers the decision from a system 1 to a system 2 in advance. So in the moment, the brain doesn't have to choose between approach or avoidance because the choice has already been made. It comes back to that planning, creating certainty. Labelling the emotion, research again carried out by Matthew Lieberman at UCLA, showed that affect labelling, in other words, naming an emotion, reduces the amygdala activation and increases prefrontal cortex, where we do all that great thinking, actually increases the engagement of the prefrontal cortex. So simply saying, even to yourself, I'm feeling anxious about this conversation, shifts processing from the reactive limbic system towards the regulatory prefrontal cortex. You're starting to move in the right direction to take back some of that control. So for managers, this is actually a micro skill with a macro impact, because teaching managers to notice and name their avoidance before it actually becomes a pattern, a habit, is one of the most practical neurological interventions that we have. The role of values and identity. Research on the self-determination theory and identity-based motivation shows that when behaviour is connected to who we believe ourselves to be, the approach system becomes significantly stronger. So what I mean by that is a manager who thinks I am someone who has honest conversations will be able to override the avoidance approach more readily than the person who thinks, I should probably have this conversation. It's about shifting the outcome focus from, I need to resolve this issue, to, I'm the kind of leader who addresses things directly and with understanding. So it's about making that connection of who we think we are, who we believe ourselves to be, and that will then help us to shift towards the approach system. Perhaps the most practical of all is regulating our nervous system first. We cannot access our cognitive resources that are needed to have a good, difficult conversation if your nervous system is already dysregulated. And when we regulate our nervous system, there's actually a sequence, and the sequence really does matter. We first of all start with we regulate. And to do that, we use techniques such as breathing techniques, the 3-3-3 reset technique, for example, breathe in for 3, hold for 3, out for 3, or perhaps physical kind of movement can also help to regulate. The second step is reappraise. That's where we start to reframe the stakes and the intent. Third, prepare. So that's all of that we talked about a minute ago, reducing the uncertainty by having a clear opening, thinking the situation through. And then finally, initiate. Actually go ahead and have that conversation. But if we do regulate, reappraise, prepare, we're actually going to have that conversation from a starting point of relatively calm and having some clarity around the purpose and what we want to achieve. And trying to skip steps 1 to 3 and go straight to the conversation is neurologically setting yourself up to either avoid or to have a conversation from a threat state, which rarely ends well. So, what is really striking about all of these mechanisms is that none of them are about willpower or courage in the traditional sense. They're about creating the right neurological conditions under which the approach system can actually override the natural avoidance system. And just this single reframe I'm about to kind of give you alone is potentially transformative. And simply going from I or you need to be braver to let's create the conditions my or your brain needs. So rather than saying, oh, I need to be brave about this, just reframing that to I'm going to create the condition my brain needs to have this conversation well. Just as we're coming up to time, there's just another couple of things just to round it up. The core reframe, and this is where it starts to kind of pull everything together because the science maps directly onto a practical framework that we can use. Before any tools or techniques, the most important thing is shifting our mind, shifting our mental model of what a difficult conversation actually is. So very often we tend to think unconsciously and frame difficult conversations as a confrontation I need to win, or it's a problem I need to fix, or it's a risk I need to manage. Now, the neurological reframe here is think about it as a difficult conversation is an act of care, either for the person, for the team, and the overall relationship. And when we genuinely adopt this frame, the brain's threat assessment of a conversation changes and it moves from status threats to purpose alignment. And that shift alone can reduce the avoidance significantly. So there is a 4-step conversation readiness model. So step 1, regulate. Get your brain online before you open your mouth. Do the regulation technique, the deep breathing, short walks. Check your own scare state. Which domains are being threatened right now as you are thinking about having this conversation or preparing for this conversation? Name your emotion. Feeling anxious, frustrated, uncertain, but name it. And what you're actually doing, this regulation, is bringing back the prefrontal cortex online. That's the part of the brain that we need for empathy, clear communication. And without this step, this is where we can so often initiate a conversation from a threat state and trigger a threat state in the other person immediately. Step 2, reframe. So change what the conversation means to your brain. And managers should ask themselves 3 questions. And preferably write down the answers. And the three questions are on screen. What is the cost of not having this conversation? The cost to the person, the team, the relationship. What is my genuine positive intent in having this conversation? And what kind of leader do I want to be in this moment? Now, again, this activates that cognitive reappraisal, shifting the brain's threat label on the conversation. It also connects the behaviour to identity and values, which strengthens the approach motivation system. Step 3, reduce uncertainty. So give your brain and their brain more certainty. Prepare one clear, specific opening sentence. Anticipate 2 or 3 likely responses and think through how you would handle each one. So rehearse them. Choose the right environment. Private, calm, no time pressures. And then signal in advance to the other person when it's appropriate. I'd like to find some time to talk about, can we meet tomorrow? And this works because uncertainty, as we said, is the primary driver of avoidance for both parties. So by reducing that uncertainty through preparation, it lowers our threat level and reduces the threat response in the person that we're having the conversation with. So, step 4, reset. Tools when the conversation gets hard during. So, here the tools are the deliberate pause. So, just buy yourself some time. Just something simple like, let me just take a moment to think about that. Affect labeling is another strategy you can use. Internally naming what you're feeling. So you're keeping in touch with your own thoughts and feelings as you are having that conversation. And curious questioning. Shift to a genuine question when things start to get tense, because that can reduce the threat for both parties and reactivates the thinking brain. And the last one is naming the dynamic. So I want to make sure this conversation feels fair to you. How are you experiencing it so far? So if you feel that the conversation is starting to get a little bit tough, just kind of stopping it and saying, I want to make sure this conversation feels right for you. How are you experiencing it so far? And that directly addresses the scare threats in the other person. Once managers have the framework, the most powerful way to embed it is through the if-then planning. And we've talked about the if-then planning. So planning is the key to uncertainty. Uncertainty is one of the biggest drivers of avoidance. And if you take nothing else away from today, please just take that away. The biggest threat to avoidance is uncertainty. So how can you overcome the uncertainty? And that brings us to a close on today. Just want to thank you for joining us.